Here's the latest with Syracuse Football.
You are Locked On Syracuse, your daily podcast on the Syracuse Orange. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome into Locked On Syracuse. I'm Jackson Holzer, and thank you for making us your first listen of every single day here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team every day, and we are free and available wherever you get your podcasts. And on today's show, we are joined by Mike McAllister. He is the publisher for Syracuse on 24/7 Sports, and we got a lot to go over here on Syracuse Football. David Reese, a new transfer portal edition. Signing day is tomorrow in college football recruiting, and also we'll talk later on about the transfer portal. And before we get to everything, today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. First of all, Mike, thank you so much for joining us here this evening. And of course, good luck to your Philadelphia Eagles in the Super Bowl on Sunday. But let's talk some Syracuse football, okay? So the Orange, last night, they land a Cal transfer, David Reese. He had 4.5 sacks last season. Why do you think Syracuse football targeted a guy like David Reese?
Well, he's if you're losing veteran leadership by losing Marlo Wax and Justin Barron, you get a guy going into his 8th year. So that's pretty good veteran experience. You know, I don't know exactly how old he is, but just doing the quick math, you're figuring like 25, 26, 27, somewhere in that range, right? It's crazy that someone like that is still eligible, but, you know, he had a couple of redshirt years, had the COVID year, so he has another year of eligibility. But it's the 4.5 sacks last year, the 6.5 sacks the year before that. He's just been a really good pass rusher, and with losing a guy like Fidel Diggs, who was their best pass rusher this past season, I think they were looking for someone who could play either defensive end, outside linebacker, maybe a little of both, but was a really good pass rusher that could kind of step in and fill in for that while some of those young guys are still developing. So getting an experienced guy who's a good pass rusher, it gives you depth at linebacker and defensive end, I think is really where targeting a guy like David Reese, former 4-star recruit, where that kind of stemmed from.
And building off of that, how do you think David Reese fits into the Syracuse defensive line rotation?
Yeah, it's hard to say right now, but I could see him doing anything from being a starter, either a defensive end or outside linebacker, to being a pass rush specialist who comes in on 3rd and long situations or obvious passing situations, 2-minute drills where you know the other team's going to pass the ball. I could see anything from either of those scenarios, anything in between. It really will be determined on when he gets here, how quickly he learns the playbook, how he does in practice, training camp, all of those types of things. I know it's kind of a boring answer, but I could see kind of anything in between. I think regardless, you'll see him on the field and you'll see him in pass rushing situations.
I think one thing to me, and you hit on this earlier about David Reese, is aside from his age and the fact that it's his 8th year of college eligibility, if I'm looking at a production standpoint with David Reese, I really like the fact that he has done what he has done, which is 11 sacks in the last 2 years, at a Power 4 level. If you recall, remember when they were targeting A.J. Pena? A.J. Pena was from Rhode Island. Like, we have seen pass rushers, I mean, Jared Verse comes to mind, come from FCS and immediately translate to the next level. But you never know. It is a gamble. When they got David Reese last night, my reaction was, okay, this is a proven, almost to a fault, a proven pass rusher at the Power 4 level that should certainly help Syracuse in their defensive line. Now, speaking of their defensive front, the Orange have added David Reese, obviously last night, and they also added Chris Thomas from Marshall earlier this offseason, more of an interior run-stuffing type of player. Do you think that they're done adding there, or could you see Syracuse adding more to its defensive front in the portal going forward?
The problem is they have limited scholarships at this point. They're somewhere in the 3 to 5 range by my calculation in terms of how many scholarships that they have available at this time. But I could, if someone that is a proven difference maker becomes available, someone like a Fidel Diggs caliber player that's, going to be playing on Sundays in some capacity, and you could see him coming in, starting, or making a big impact on defense. I don't think they're going to add someone just to add someone, like a depth piece, because of the guys that they already have that they've brought in, as you mentioned, Reese and Chris Thomas and, a couple other guys, on top of who they brought in last year, not only through the portal, but specifically in high school recruiting. You got to remember, a guy like King Joseph Edwards is another year into the system, and you figure he's going to add more strength and weight to his frame this offseason. Caden Brown, another guy who could play linebacker, defensive end. So they brought in several guys last year that I think, could be ready to step up and play a larger role. And then along the interior, they get Tank Wilson back, which I think is huge. The fact that a lot of those games where the run defense was really bad, he wasn't there, especially the Boston College game. I think that tells you a lot about how valuable he was, even if you just look at raw statistics and you say, okay, well, what did this guy really do? But the combination of him and Thomas in the middle, I think, should help the run defense quite a bit.
I agree with you on that. And it's interesting that you mentioned the scholarships and the lack thereof, because Syracuse football, will talk on it very soon about their recruiting class. They took 34, soon to be 35 players in its 2025 recruiting class. I guess my final question about David Reese is, why did they decide to make this move now as opposed to waiting until the spring to see who else becomes available due to their lack of scholarships?
Well, one, you don't know who is going to become available. And so if you wait, you risk not being able to find someone that you think can make an impact. And so if you see someone who can make an impact, you go after that guy. Second, he was kind of a late addition to the transfer portal. He only entered, 2 weeks ago or so. And so because he was a grad transfer, that's the thing. Even though the portal is closed, grad transfers can enter at any time. So he enters, I think January 21st was the date, if I'm remembering correctly. He enters the transfer portal, and it was only about 2 weeks later that he committed to Syracuse, which tells you that as soon as he became available, they immediately went after him. So they viewed him as someone who makes their roster better, has the potential to make an immediate impact. And I think because he became available when he did, other schools had filled up. That gave Syracuse a little bit of a leg up. And they did recruit him out of high school, even though it was a different coaching staff at the time. So there was some familiarity there. And that helped, Syracuse land him. And it just seems to be a good fit for both sides.
I also do believe, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I do believe it, and it was so long ago. Fun fact, David Reese was in the same high school recruiting class as Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields. But I do believe, last time I checked, that Syracuse had offered him out of high school. So it's very interesting, or very cool, that it all comes full circle. David Reese, a Cal transfer edge, 11 sacks in the last 2 seasons, committed to Syracuse last night in the transfer portal. Looking for tickets to your next big event, whether it's a concert, a comedy show, or a sports game, finding the right ticket at the right price can be a headache. But with Gametime Picks, it's never been easier. Let me tell you how it works. With Gametime Picks, the app does all the hard work for you. It curates the best deals, so you don't have to waste time searching through endless ticket listings. I've been using Gametime Picks for a while now, and here's why I love it. The curated deals make it super simple to find great tickets at a great price. No more shifting through thousands of options. I recently grabbed a super deal for a prime seat, and I couldn't believe the value. It was a steal. The seat view feature is a game changer. Before I even hit buy, I can see exactly what my seat will look like in the venue. It's so reassuring. And the best part, you're covered with Gametime's lowest price guarantee. If you find a better deal somewhere else, they'll refund you 110% of the difference. Plus, your tickets are guaranteed to be delivered on time with easy cancellation options if something comes up. Ready to make your next event even better? Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, that's code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. We are joined by Mike McAllister, the publisher for Syracuse on 24/7 Sports. We just talked about David Reese and committing to Syracuse, but now let's shift gears. Let's talk about recruiting. College football, high school recruiting signing day is officially tomorrow. Now, for those that are unaware, there's the early signing period, which is when the majority of high school recruits sign. That was in December, and we had a whole podcast breaking that down. But the official one is tomorrow. So, Mike, should we expect any major activity for Syracuse tomorrow with the official signing period?
Major, no. Now, I will always leave the room open for surprises. We remember a few years ago, all of a sudden the Syracuse Football Twitter account announced signing of an Australian punter, and everyone's like, wait, who? Where did this come from? So there's always room for there to be some stealth-like activity. I even remember last recruiting cycle, the 2024 recruiting cycle, when Syracuse got Ibn McDaniels to come up and visit and got him to commit. He was someone who was a very under-the-radar recruit that, Syracuse didn't really want his name out there because they thought if it was, other schools would come looking at him and that could, derail their ability to land him. So there could be something like that goes on. There's always, coaching staffs who will try to be secretive if they think they really found a diamond in the rough and someone who is definitely power 4 caliber that could develop into a really good starter that for whatever reason other schools have overlooked. So there's that possibility. But as of right now, the expectation is that the one player who didn't sign early because he committed after that early signing period is running back Tylik Hill, who played at Pope John High School in New Jersey. He had over 2,800 all-purpose yards and 29 total touchdowns last year. 2,300 of those yards were on the ground. One of the most productive running backs in the Northeast. I mean, that is a ton of yards. So how he was so far under the radar, I have no idea. It seems almost impossible that someone in a state like New Jersey could put up those kind of numbers, and his only other D1 offer was from UMass. And when you watch his film too, I mean, he looks like a very talented, capable, power 4 type of running back. So the fact that no one else found him and Fran Brown did, I mean, kudos to the Syracuse coaching staff, but he's expected to sign, and that's the only one that we know of as of right now. Given, as we mentioned before, with the lack of scholarships available, I'm not expecting there to be some flurry of surprises, but you always leave the door open for one or two.
Fair enough, Mike. So there is one player that I really want to hit on here, and that is 4-star defensive back Javari Flowers. He was originally in the class of 2026, but recently he reclassified to 2025. Now, Mike, I don't think he is expected to sign tomorrow, correct, with any school?
That's my understanding. Now, anyone, that can change at any point, but yeah, there isn't the expectation that's going to happen.
Fair enough. All right. So how does Syracuse stack up in the race for Javari Flowers?
It's hard to say with his reclassification. Here's the thing with Syracuse. They have brought in a bunch of defensive backs in the last 2 years, last 2 recruiting cycles, several this recruiting cycle, highlighted by Dimitri Samuels. Now, Flowers is looked at as a corner, Samuels is a safety, but they've got several others that they brought in, not only in this recruiting class, but in 2024 as well, some through the portal. I don't know that there is a strong favorite at this point, but I would say Georgia and Miami are both going after him really hard. He is from Florida. And so when those types of schools are involved, I would put them as kind of the schools to beat. Syracuse, they do have some things that they can pitch to him that they would have an advantage over some of those other schools, meaning, hey, you come here, you're going to be one of, if not the most talented corner on a roster. So you're going to have a great opportunity to play a lot right away, maybe more so than at a school like a Georgia. That said, I think given Syracuse's small amount of scholarships available, and that's not necessarily a huge position of need because of how well they've recruited it the last 2 cycles, I don't see it as a great fit. I don't think if you're Syracuse, you pass on a talent like that if he wanted to come here. But I think smart money right now is that Georgia and Miami are probably the 2 schools to beat.
Just for clarification, Mike, do you know exactly how many scholarships they have available, assuming that Hill signs tomorrow?
So my count, this includes both Hill and Reese, is that they have 3 to play with. Now, that's my count of my own on my own math of going through everyone who is coming back, who is not, etc. There are almost always, what happens when they release the spring football roster is there's a few players that aren't included that are no longer on the program for various reasons. They've decided to leave. They're retiring from football. There's medical issues, a million different reasons why that type of stuff can happen. But there always seems to be at least a couple. So that could free up a couple more. But assuming you're going by the 105 number, which is what everyone is kind of expecting once all of that legal stuff goes through, and assuming that all passes, then I think they've only got like 3 to 4 left. But again, that's not an official number from SU. That's my own number from doing my counts and calculations. It doesn't take into the fact that there could be some that are left off the roster this spring. And also, you have to keep in mind, there is that post-spring window that you mentioned before. And so you would expect that there might be a few players that going through spring practice could say, I don't think I'm going to play next year. Maybe I want to go somewhere else. That'll free up some more room, and they could go then peruse players that do the same thing from other schools.
All right. And finally, on this topic of signing day tomorrow and Syracuse football recruiting, what are your thoughts? What is your general take on Syracuse's 2025 recruiting class?
Yeah, I mean, the most players of any class in the country, and there is a huge Northeast influence to that class. Specifically, I know one of the complaints about the Dino Baber staff is they didn't recruit New York as heavily as I think a lot of fans and coaches in New York, high school coaches in New York, would have liked. And Syracuse has kind of taken the opposite approach. I mean, they've got 3 or 4 players just from CBA. They got a kid from CNS. They've recruited a ton of kids from across the state that are maybe a little bit under the radar, but guys that are, 6'1", 6'2" defensive backs and can really run. I think they've done a great job with scouting from that standpoint. They got a kid from Rochester in Quante Gillians, who is a defensive lineman that I think has the potential to be really good. He's, I think, an 89 grade or 88 grade, something like that on 24/7, which is a 90 gets you a 4-star. So he's basically a 4-star, just borderline outside of being a 4-star. And, they've hit New Jersey really hard, but it's that New York recruiting that I've really been surprised with the fact that not only have they recruited it hard and they've landed a bunch of players from the state, but that they've done so not just hitting up, we're going to take a couple kids from CBA. We're going to go down to New York City and take a couple of kids that are Power 4 caliber there. And then that's kind of it. They've really done a good job at recruiting the state and scouting the state as a whole to find some guys in areas that aren't normally heavily recruited and getting those players that they think have potential.
And building on your point about New York, when I did the signing day podcast, the early signing day podcast, I should say, I don't remember it exactly off the top of my head, so please forgive me. You can go back and watch or listen to that podcast. But I think it was like 8 or 9 of the top 10 players in New York committed to Syracuse. So I talked about how they basically monopolized the state. And it's great because eventually there's going to be a big time recruit. And Syracuse is going to have an inside track on potentially landing him, a.k.a. a guy like Messiah Hampton, right?
Yeah,
that's a chance.
Yeah, and there's even a kid in 2027, Oakley Keegan, who is a tight end from Liverpool High School, so right around the corner here. And he's visited multiple times. He's got an offer, also has a Boston College offer. But, I mean, he has the potential to be really good. He's like 6'7", 215, something like that. Willing blocker, athletic, I think could end up being a good receiving tight end at the next level. Obviously still has a long way to go in his development, but intriguing prospect. So they've done a really good job. And to your point, part of the issue with not recruiting New York State under previous coaching staffs as heavily as what they are now is when you have a big-time recruit who's a 4-star who has schools like Penn State, Notre Dame, and Ohio State, and those types of schools coming after him. When Syracuse hasn't recruited New York heavily, you don't have those established relationships with the coaches. Because I think, honestly, like high school coaches, especially locally, right, they'd love to see their kids go to Syracuse. They can watch them play, watch them develop, good relationship with Fran Brown and that coaching staff so that they feel good about their kids going there. When you get a 4-star, 5-star caliber player at one of these local schools and you basically haven't ever shown up, even during your spring recruiting visits, showing up to the school, chit-chatting with the coaches, developing those relationships, all of that, it makes it much harder to all of a sudden then show up and say, oh yeah, we're the in-state school, you should come here now. Like, well, where have you been with all these other guys that we were sending to, UConn and Rutgers and whatever else? It's a different philosophy than what we were used to. Dino Baber said, if you're from New York and I don't think that you're going to start, I'm not going to go after you because I don't think it's beneficial to our program to have a bunch of New York kids that don't play. And Fran Brown has basically said, if I think you're a Power 4 caliber player and you're from New York, I'm going after you. It's a different philosophy, and I think has the potential to pay off, as you mentioned, with a guy like Messiah Hampton. When you get those elite level recruits, it really helps. And the kids from CBA, the one last thing I'll mention on that, they all had other Power 4 offers. Like, they had the Pittsburghs and the Rutgers and the Boston Colleges and those types of teams after them. So it's not like Syracuse is just taking kids to take kids. They're taking kids. They have a scouting process. Other Power 4 schools have scouted those players and deemed them worthy of a scholarship offer as well. So they've done a really good job at getting guys that have other Power 4 offers as well.
We are joined by Mike McAllister, the publisher for Syracuse on 24/7 Sports. Earlier in the show, we talked about David Reese in the transfer portal. We just talked about signing day for Syracuse football, as well as other recruiting updates as well. Now let's come full circle. Let's re-talk about the transfer portal, because earlier we just talked specifically about David Reese. Now, for those that don't know, there is a spring transfer portal window, which gives everyone in college football another chance to put their name in the hat. It runs from April 16th to April 25th. So, Mike, what else do you think Syracuse football is targeting in the portal specifically?
Well, the one interesting thing about that late window, I think there was a comment by Nebraska head coach Matt Rule recently where he basically said, I don't think doing a spring game is beneficial because then you showcase our players and then there's tampering and et cetera, et cetera. So let's throw out a scenario where Ricky Collins comes out in the spring game and throws 5 touchdowns and looks absolutely unbelievable. And then you get a school that has a quarterback get hurt during the spring game, or their quarterbacks don't look the same way that they thought. And all of a sudden they're like, oh, maybe we should have went after that kid. Let's have some back alley conversations and throw a bunch of NIL money at him. That's, I think, what the concern from Matt Rule is scenarios like that, just to put a Syracuse perspective on it. So it's going to be really interesting to see who enters the portal between guys who don't think that they're going to be in favorable positions to start versus players who maybe think that they showcase themselves well enough that they're in for a big payday. There's going to be kind of a mix there. I think if you're Syracuse, they lost a wide receiver in Chris Long, who came from Rutgers and then reopened his recruitment. They went after a transfer from Penn State who ultimately committed to Washington. So I think they're still looking for a wide receiver, specifically someone with speed that can stretch the field. I think in a perfect world, they might see if they could find someone who they think is starting worthy along the offensive line, potentially. And then depending on what they think of Reese, whether he's a linebacker or a defensive end, I could see them targeting the other. If they think he's a defensive end, targeting a linebacker. But they have also targeted a couple of middle linebackers. I don't think Reese is a middle backer, so they could target one of those. And then they've also been looking at safeties in the transfer portal. Haven't landed one of those yet. So I could see, depending on who becomes available, that they look at a safety to come in and potentially fill in for a guy like Elijah Clark that has left the program because his eligibility is gone.
It's interesting that you mentioned the Penn State wide receiver. That is Amari Evans, who committed to Washington. I was pretty taken aback. I was pretty surprised that they were going after a wide receiver, even though Chris Long reopened his recruitment, because I think the wide receiver unit is pretty good. So I'm very curious to know, and I think all of us are curious to know, whether or not Amari Evans was a special exemption or if they're actually looking for another wide receiver. And I think you kind of hit on that they might be looking at a field stretcher.
Yeah, and I think, it might depend on the status of some of the guys they have on the roster. I mean, you look at like Trevor Pena, right? He's coming back. Obviously, that's huge. Justice Ross Simmons showed some flashes last year. Hopefully he's healthy for all of 2025. I think that would make a huge difference. He could, I think, step into the Jackson Meeks type of a role in what he could be. But, what happens with Zeed Haynes? We know he started the season as a starter and then was away from the program for a while, came back towards the end of the season but didn't play. Is he back and basically ready to go, full speed, all things go, etc., and he's going to play the whole year? Then I think you have your field stretcher. If for some reason he's not, for whatever reason, he didn't enter the portal, so at least during the early window. So when the spring roster comes out, is he still on it? If assuming he is, which I think is everyone's expectation, then that could be your guy. But they could also be looking for someone who could fill that role in case he has injury issues or has to leave the program again for personal reasons next year. There's a lot of things you could be looking at there. They could also be looking and saying, we think a couple of these young guys that played a little bit here and there maybe are another year away from really being consistent contributors. And so they're looking for another guy for depth purposes. Maybe they're also looking at someone who not only can be a field stretcher, but can also be a returner. That could be something they're looking at to try to bolster their special teams a little bit so that Trevor Pena doesn't have to be a primary returner and can just focus on offense, especially as a punt returner. You just don't know, but I don't think that they're in a position, even if you like the wide receivers room, and I do, I don't think they're in a position where they're going to say, we think that guy is a stud. We think he could come in and make a difference for us. We're going to say no, though, because I don't think they would say no. I don't think they'd have to force it. Like they don't have to find a receiver to find somebody and hope it turns out. But if there's a guy they think is a difference maker that can really bolster the roster, then they won't be afraid to go after him.
All right. And speaking of the offensive line, you mentioned that could be a position of interest for Syracuse football in the spring portal window. I was curious to know, is there any update on two players regarding their fifth years? And that's Mark Petrie and Jacob Bradford. Is there anything that you can share about that?
I think it was Petrie that posted something on Instagram that suggested he's coming back. I haven't heard anything specific about whether or not that's like official. There could be some things with SU and the NCAA that have to be filed because of all the legal stuff going around with the JUCO players and all that type of stuff. So I don't think it's just as simple as he says he's coming back, it's done. I do think that's the expectation. But Jacob Bradford, it's been silent on. And so I think we will learn a lot more on both when the spring roster comes out. If the spring roster comes out and they're both on it, then I think you can pretty much assume that they're going to be back next year, which would be huge. If one or both of them are not, then I think that tells you that they either don't have any eligibility left or maybe they don't want to play football anymore. That's the other thing is if you're an offensive lineman, you've been playing football for 4 or 5 years and you're like, you know what, my knees are killing me. I just want to go do something else. So that could be, you never know if that's a possibility as well. But as of right now, I think the expectation is that Petrie definitely will be back. And Bradford is a little bit up in the air.
Well, that's good news regarding Mark Petrie. I did see that Instagram post. It was very interesting.
It's a little vague, though.
It was so vague, and it was a long time ago. And it's so weird how it has just gone silent since then. Because I've had people say, I've had people comment, he said he's coming back. And I'm like, well, you would think there'd be some sort of announcement or some sort of official report that he's coming back. But you're saying it, I'm saying it. Nobody else is saying that we see anything. So you're right. It might just come down to the spring roster, and it would be a nice surprise if one of or both of them are on the roster because they were the starting guards for Syracuse football last season. And if they're on the team next year, I don't really think they need to add to the offensive line in the spring portal window. Mike, before I let you go here, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, just along the offensive line, just another note. I know they got some flack last year at times, and they certainly had a couple games where they struggled, but if Bradford and Petrie are not coming back, they're losing 4 of their 5 starters. And as much talk as there has been about the fact that they're losing McCord for next year and some of the other weapons, LeQuint and Jackson Meeks, Gadsden, even defensively, Clark, Barron, Wax, Diggs, etc. Losing 4 of your 5 starters along the offensive line, especially with that schedule next year, is tough. The good news is Syracuse did recruit guys with multiple years of eligibility last year that played. Demetrius Weatherspoon, Joshua Miller, etc. They had some recruits they brought in, even a guy like Cody Hornsby, who didn't play a ton, but did a little bit here and there. So I think, were planning for that possibility that they could be losing several starters, but getting a guy like Petrie and or Bradford back really helps, because then you don't have as much turnover. But I'm really curious what they're going to do at left tackle with Savion Washington gone, because I think he got better as the year went along, and it's going to be interesting to see, does Enrique Cruz step right in there? Do they have Demetrius Weatherspoon and Josh Miller battle it out for two of the tackle spots? I mean, there's a lot of possibilities there, so I think left tackle is going to be really interesting.
All right, Mike, thank you so much. Mike is the publisher for Syracuse on 24/7 Sports. And Mike, where can people find you on social media?
You can find me at my Twitter account at McAllisterMike1, and that's MCA for the McAllister, or you can find us at Syracuse on 247. I personally am also on Blue Sky and Threads. You can find me at Mike McAllister, and also Instagram, and a little bit on TikTok. I just got TikTok live access, so I might be doing some lives at some point to talk about Syracuse football and recruiting. But those are the primary places you can find us. Then, of course, our website at CuseNation.com.
All right. Thank you so much, Mike, and go Eagles.
Thank you, sir. Go Birds.